The deer did not come before the funeral. They came after. 3 days after the graves were covered, the first deer appeared beneath the orchard trees in the late afternoon. 1. Then the following evening, 3. By the end of the first week, a small herd moved through the orchard at dusk and stayed until dark. No one in the valley could explain why they had not come before. Thomas Carver had worked the East Ridge property for 22 years. He had come to the valley in 1838 as a young man of 24 with a wife named Margaret and enough money to buy the raw ground and not much else, and had built the property the way such things were built in the Ozark Hill Country, season by season, clearing by clearing, the slow accumulation of a farm from raw ground. The orchard had been Margaret's project. She had brought seedling stock from her family's property in the next drainage and had planted the trees in the second year, and they had been bearing since 1844, apple and pear, and one old quince that nobody particularly wanted, but that had become part of the property, the way old things became part of properties. His wife had died in 1851. Her name had been Margaret. Sarah had been 11. The years between 1851 and 1860 had been the years of Sarah growing up. Thomas had watched this with the attentiveness of a man who understood that he was the only parent and therefore needed to be paying attention, and he had paid attention. He had watched Sarah learn the orchard and take it over in the ways that young people took over the work of the people who were gone, which was gradually and then completely. By the time she was 15, she was managing the pruning schedule. By 17, she was keeping the harvest accounts. She had her mother's patience with growing things. She had her mother's quiet habits. He had not told her this often enough. Sarah had grown up managing the orchard with her father's help. She had learned the pruning and the grafting, and the harvest and the winter care. And she had added one practice that had not been part of the original management. She fed the deer, not with troughs or deliberate feeding stations. She simply took the fallen fruit in autumn, the drops that came before the harvest, the damaged apples that were not worth keeping, and she left them at the edge of the orchard where the trees met the field. She had been doing this since she was 12 or 13, which was how old children were when they developed the habits that would define them. She had not talked much about it. Thomas had known she did it the way he knew most of what his daughter did, through the evidence of her actions rather than her accounts of them. He had respected this. She had a right to her own practices. He had not asked about the deer feeding because she had not offered it, and he had understood, somewhere, that some things were hers to do without explanation. He wished in March of 1860, crouched in the snow with the cloth-wrapped apples, that he had asked anyway. Sarah had died in January of 1860. She was 20. Thomas had survived the same fever by 4 days. He had understood, lying in his own bed in the same week, that he was going to survive, and that Sarah was not, and that understanding had been the hardest thing of his life. He had been in the room, but she had not been conscious, and what he had said to her he had said knowing she could not hear it, because saying it was necessary regardless. He had carried the absence of a goodbye through the winter and into the spring. When he found the apple caches in March, the cloth-wrapped stores in the 4 locations, the preparation for a winter she had not lived to see, he had sat in the snow for a long time. He had not resolved the absence of the goodbye, but the caches had given him something, evidence that Sarah had been planning forward, had been caring for things that would outlive her, had been doing the quiet work of someone who intended to continue. He found the caches in March. It mattered more than he expected it to. They had buried Sarah and her mother in the orchard, beneath the oldest apple tree, where the ground was soft enough in January for a grave, and where Sarah had spent more of her life than anywhere except the house. 3 days later the deer came. The valley noticed before Thomas did. He had been in the house in the January dark, doing what surviving a thing required, the practical decisions, the correspondence, the management of a grief that had no shape yet because it was too large to have a shape. He had not been at the window in the evenings. He had not been watching the orchard. His neighbor Golt had been watching. Golt had been walking the ridge road at dusk, the way he walked it most evenings, not for any particular purpose, but because he had found that walking the ridge road at dusk was the hour in which he understood his property and his valley most clearly, and he had been doing it since he was 30, and was now 52, and had no intention of stopping. He had been walking the ridge road at dusk on the 4th evening when he saw the deer in the orchard, a group of 7, moving through the trees in the late light, unhurried, their breath visible in the cold. He had stopped on the road and watched them for several minutes. Then he had gone home and told his wife. Galt was a man who had been watching the Ozark Hill country for 40 years and who had developed, over those years, the specific quality of observation that came from paying close attention to a place over a long time. He knew the ridge road and its wildlife the way a man knew his own fields, not with formal knowledge, but with the accumulated awareness of repeated attention. He said, "The deer are in Carver's orchard," she said. "They come to orchards in winter." He said, "They're moving through like they know the place, and they weren't there in the fall." She said, "How do you know they weren't there in the fall?" He said, "I drive that road every day. I would have seen them." She was quiet. He said, "They came after the burials." She looked at him. He said, "I know how that sounds." She said, "It sounds like what you saw." The hunters were the ones who made it a settlement matter. There were 3 men in the valley who hunted the East Ridge regularly, who knew the deer patterns through that section of the hill country, which fields they preferred, and which timber they moved through, and which routes they took between feeding and bedding. They had hunted the East Ridge for years, and they knew where the deer were supposed to be in January, which was not in the Carver orchard. The first hunter to notice said, "The orchard deer don't spook." He had walked within 30 feet of the group on his way across the field, and the deer had looked at him and continued feeding. Not tame, they had the edge of wild animals, the awareness and the readiness, but unafraid in a way that field deer were not usually unafraid, as if the orchard were a space they had decided was safe. The second hunter said, "I tried to push them out. They moved to the other side of the orchard and came back." The third hunter was named Aldred, who had been working that section of the ridge since before the Carver property was built, and who had the specific knowledge of the terrain that came from decades of attention. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Sarah Carver fed them every winter for years, the apples at the field edge. Anybody who worked that road in winter saw the tracks." The first hunter said, "So they're coming back for the apples." The third said, "The apples are gone. They were harvested in October. There's nothing in that orchard that a deer would go to specifically." The first hunter said, "Then why are they going?" The third hunter said, "That's the question. They were harvested in October." They were quiet. The third said, "They're not coming for the apples. They're coming for the place the apples were." 8 winters is a long time, long enough for a habit to become a root. Long enough for a generation of deer to be born knowing that the Carver orchard is a place where winter gets easier. Sarah Carver made this place for them. They don't know she's gone. Thomas went to the orchard in February. He had been avoiding it since the burial, which he understood and did not judge himself for. The orchard was where they were buried, and the orchard was where Sarah had spent her childhood, and the orchard was, at the moment, more grief than he could manage in addition to everything else that was grief. In February, 6 weeks after the burial, he put on his coat in the early evening and walked across the yard to the orchard gate. The deer were already there. He stopped at the gate and counted 9 of them, moving through the trees in the gray February dusk, pausing at the graves, moving on. They registered his presence without alarm. One doe looked at him with the direct attention of an animal that had been around people enough to assess them, rather than simply flee. He had not gone directly to the graves. He had stood at the gate and looked at the deer first, and at the trees, and at the familiar lines of the orchard he had been looking at for 22 years. He had built this gate. He had laid the fence posts. He had watched Sarah walk through this gate 10,000 times. He had watched her carry the apple buckets to the field edge. He had watched her at harvest and at pruning, and in the long winter maintenance walks she made through the trees, checking each one. He had watched her become, without ceremony or announcement, the person who understood the orchard better than he did. He stood at the gate for a long time. He thought about Sarah at the field edge in November, moving the fallen apples. He had watched her do it 100 times from the kitchen window. She had done it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone performing a necessary task, and it had been a necessary task for her. Necessary in the way that certain acts of care were necessary to certain people. Not optional, not sentimental, simply part of what they did. He thought. She fed them for 8 years. Of course they remember. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. The valley had a way of receiving unusual things, not with alarm and not with credulity, but with the measured attention of people who had been living in a place long enough to know that the place sometimes did things that required attention before they required explanation. The valley's accounts of the deer multiplied through the winter, not exaggerated accounts. The valley was not given to exaggeration, or at least not to more exaggeration than human nature generally provided. The accounts were of the deer themselves, how many, how regular, what they did in the orchard. The count grew through January, 7 in the first week, then 9, then sometimes as many as 15. The orchard was not large enough to be a natural herd gathering. It was a family orchard, not a field, and 15 deer in an orchard was 15 deer that had chosen to be in an orchard rather than somewhere more practical. They arrived every evening, not at a fixed hour. It varied with the light, which varied with the weather, but consistently at dusk, the transition between afternoon and dark. They stayed through the early evening and were gone before midnight. Nobody stayed up to watch them leave. This was deduced from the tracks, which showed the orchard occupied at 10 o'clock and empty by morning. They were not eating the orchard. This was noted. Winter deer ate bark and browse and what fallen fruit they could find in the snow. The Carver orchard had been cleared of its fruit. The trees showed no significant bark damage. Some, the kind that happened in any hard winter, but not the stripping of stressed animals with no other food source. The deer were in the orchard, and they were not, principally, eating it. One woman said, "They're visiting." Her husband said, "Deer don't visit." She said, "I've been watching them from the road for 3 weeks. They move through the trees and come back to the graves. Whatever that means to them, it means something." He had no response to this. The discovery came in March. The snow had been deep all winter, and it began to consolidate in the first warm weeks of March, settling and hardening into the dense pack that preceded the spring melt. Thomas was in the orchard checking the trees when he found the first cache, a hollow between 2 roots of the oldest apple tree, filled with dried apples wrapped in cloth. He had spent the winter not going into the orchard, and he had spent it knowing that eventually he would need to, and March had made the need practical. The trees required their spring check. He was a farmer, and the trees needed him. He had not been looking for anything except frost damage. He had been checking the oldest tree for frost damage to the bark, the kind of inspection he did every spring to understand what the winter had cost. When the cloth had caught his eye in the packed snow between the roots, he crouched beside it and looked at it for a long time. The cloth was one of Sarah's. He knew the weave, the color, the way she had hemmed it. The apples were from the fall harvest, the ones he had assumed were still in the root cellar. He checked the root cellar that evening. The count was short, significantly short. He went back to the orchard, and he looked. He found 3 more caches, one beneath a pear tree, one in the corner of the fence where the posts met, one under the flat rock near the orchard gate that had always been there, and that he had stepped over for 20 years, all of them in cloth, all of them apples from the fall harvest. All of them placed where the deer would find them in late winter, when the snow was deep and the food was scarce. She had been preparing for this winter before she knew she wouldn't survive it. He did not move for a long time. He thought about October, when Sarah had been alive, and the harvest was happening, and he had been in the barn while she was in the orchard. He thought about the fall stores, and the root cellar count, and the cloth he had recognized. He thought about Sarah at 19, 20, old enough to understand what a hard winter meant to a deer herd that had been feeding in the same orchard for years, old enough to plan for it. He sat in the orchard in the March snow, with the cloth-wrapped apples in his hands, and he understood that his daughter had been caring for these animals for 8 years, and had been caring for them in the fall that killed her, and had not said anything about it because it was simply what she did. He left the caches. He could not bring himself to move them. The deer found them. He saw the evidence over the following days: the cloth displaced, the apple remains in the snow, the tracks concentrated around the 4 sites. The deer ate what Sarah had left for them. He stood at the orchard gate in the mornings and watched the tracks. He had not been a man who talked to himself before January of 1860. He had been a man who thought things and kept them. In the year after the burial he had started talking in the orchard. Not loudly, not at length, but in the small comments that accumulated when you had been speaking to someone for 20 years and they were gone. He talked to Sarah in the orchard, and he was aware this was unusual, and he continued. He said, "They found the cache under the pear tree today. The big doe was here again last evening. I thought I understood everything you were doing. I didn't know about the October wrapping. I didn't know about the 4 locations. I knew about the apple drops at the field edge, and I thought that was the whole of it. It turns out I only understood half of it. I'm not sure that's wrong, actually. I think maybe you only let people understand half of what you did. I think the other half was yours. I'm keeping the other half now. I hope that's all right." He stood at the orchard gate in the mornings and watched the tracks, and he thought about his daughter. He thought about the 12-year-old who had started moving apple drops to the field edge. About the 20-year-old who had been wrapping stores in cloth and hiding them in the roots and under the rocks before the first hard freeze. About the 8 winters of it, the unannounced, sustained habit of care, he thought. I knew she did this. He had known since she was 12 or 13. He had seen the apple drops moved to the field edge. He had seen the deer tracks near the orchard through the winters. He had understood without asking, he thought. I never asked about it. I should have asked about it. She would have looked at him with the patience she had for obvious questions. She would have said, "They come through every winter. They need the food. It's not complicated." He could hear her saying it, he thought. It wasn't complicated. That was the truth of it. The deer returned the following winter. Thomas had been waiting for this, the way he had been waiting for many things that first year, the calendar to turn, the seasons to change, the test of whether ordinary things persisted. The deer were one test. They passed it. They appeared in the orchard in November, before the snow, moving through the trees with the ease of animals on familiar ground. He had gone into the root cellar in October of that first year and counted the stores with Sarah's practice in mind, which was a thing he had never done before, had never counted the stores with the deer in mind, had always counted them as winter food for the house. He had counted them and set aside a share. He brought apples. He had saved them from the October harvest, the way Sarah had saved them, and he had wrapped them in cloth the way she had wrapped them, and in November he had placed them in the 4 locations she had used. He had found the locations in March, when he found the original caches. The locations were the same each year. He had checked, the first autumn, whether the deer spent the most time near those 4 spots, and they had. He had found the locations by the tracks. He stood at the orchard gate and watched the deer move through the trees. He thought, she would have done this, so I'll do it. He went back to the house. He did this for 11 years. He had kept the practice without telling many people. Galt knew, 1 or 2 others, but he had not made it a public thing, partly because it did not feel like a public thing, and partly because he had no desire to explain it. It was Sarah's practice, and he was keeping it, and the deer came, and that was enough. In the early years it had been grief work, the specific activity that required doing something the lost person had done, maintaining the shape of their presence through the continuation of their practice. In the later years the grief had changed shape, as grief did, and the orchard work had become its own thing, the wrapping in October, the 4 sites, the watching in the evenings. He did this for 11 years. Every fall he wrapped stores in cloth and placed them in the orchard before the hard freeze. Every winter the deer came. Every spring he found the cloth displaced and the stores gone, and the tracks of the animals that had eaten them. He told one person about Sarah's caches, Galt, in the second winter, when Galt asked him directly why the deer continued to come. He said, "Sarah hid winter stores for them. I found them in the spring. I've been doing it since." Galt said, "You're keeping her practice." He said, "Yes, I'm keeping her practice." Galt looked at the orchard. He said, She was a careful person, Thomas said. Yes, I know, Gold said. The kind of careful that doesn't announce itself, Thomas said. Yes, exactly that kind. They stood at the gate in the December dusk and watched the deer in the trees. Gold said, "Does it help?" He thought about that. He said, "Yes, it does. I didn't know how much until I started." The year Thomas died was 1871. He had been in the orchard in October of that year, placing the fall caches, when his heart had made the decision that hearts make, and he had sat down beneath the oldest apple tree and not gotten up. He was buried beside Sarah and his wife, beneath the same tree, in the same ground. The deer came that winter without the stores. Thomas had placed the October caches before he died, but he had not placed the November editions, and the December caches were not there. The deer came anyway. They moved through the orchard and spent time near the graves and found what they found, which was not much in a hard winter, and came back the following evening. Thomas had no surviving family in the valley. The property was held in trust by the Milltown lawyer until the estate was sorted, which took several years and was never fully sorted to anyone's satisfaction. The orchard continued to produce. The deer continued to come. A neighbor named Pruitt, who had been managing the Carver property since Thomas's health had declined, began placing the caches the winter after Thomas died. She had known about the practice. Thomas had told a few people by then, in the way that practices require the telling to survive, and she had understood it as a thing the property required. She did it for 6 years before her own health required her to stop. By then, others knew. The valley had the practice and the name and the 4 locations. New people learned it from old people. Children who were old enough to help were brought to the orchard in October to participate in the wrapping and placement. The orchard changed hands twice between 1871 and 1890. Both times the new owners were told about Sarah's feeding. Both times they kept it. One new owner said, the first winter he placed the caches, "I never knew this girl, and I'm wrapping apples for her deer." His wife said, "You're wrapping apples for the deer." "Sarah Carver did it first," he said. "Is there a difference?" She said, "There's a reason." He wrapped the apples. The valley kept the practice alive for a generation, not without interruption. There were winters when the person who held the practice moved away, or was ill, or simply did not get to it, and the deer came anyway. And there were winters when the caches were placed and the deer did not come, because deer had their own reasons for their movements that had nothing to do with human practices. But the practice persisted, passed between neighbors and their children. The knowledge of the 4 locations and the cloth and the stored apples transmitted with the specific care of something that mattered without having a category. The name had come from Thomas himself, who had told Gold and 1 or 2 others simply, "I'm keeping up Sarah's feeding." The phrase had traveled the way phrases traveled in small valleys, attached to the thing it described, passed from the people who knew the context to the people who didn't, surviving the loss of context and becoming its own fact. They called it Sarah's feeding. Nobody who used the term had known Sarah Carver. By the time the term was common, she had been dead for a decade. But her name had attached to the practice, and the practice had attached to the orchard, and the orchard had attached to the graves, and the whole thing had become a single thing in the valley's memory. Old men in the Ozark hill country said, in the years after, that the deer were returning to the graves. Others said they were returning to the orchard, which had been their winter feeding ground for 30 years, and which they associated with food and safety in the way that animals associated reliable places with food and safety. The old men said, "There is no difference. The orchard belonged to the family. The family was in the orchard. The deer remembered the orchard and the family together, the way you remembered a place and the people in it together, because the place and the people had been the same thing for long enough." That was the whole account, such as it was. The valley had kept it for 30 years without needing to resolve what it meant. The deer had kept coming. The caches had kept being placed. The orchard had continued bearing. The graves beneath the oldest apple tree had weathered to the color of the ground. A girl who had fed deer in secret for 8 winters. A father who had continued it for 11 years without being asked. A valley that had continued it for a generation, and deer that came every winter to the orchard beneath the oldest apple tree. In the late light, unhurried, as if the ground there had always been safe,